We are live. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On today's show, I have two very special guests. They just published a book in November 2021. Title of the book is The Vote Collectors, the true story of scamsters, politicians, and preachers behind the nation's greatest electoral fraud. Their names are Michael Graff and Nick Ochsner. And this is both their first books, but I read a lot of it. It's really interesting and takes place in Bladen County in the southeastern part of North Carolina, but in North Carolina in general. But they can both talk about it. So welcome to the show, Michael and Nick. Thanks for coming on.
Thank you, William.
For one of you guys can start. You guys can just decide who wants to go first. But can you talk about your background? Or you do talk about it in the book, your background, and what led you to write The Vote Collectors?
Yeah, I think that's part of the beauty of the book is that Nick and I come at it from different journalistic backgrounds. Nick's an incredible investigative reporter here in Charlotte, and I'm I'm a long form magazine writer. I built a career as a long form magazine writer, so we came at it from different angles. But I grew up in working for newspapers, went to magazines, and now I'm the editor of Axios Charlotte. And in 2018, when this story broke, Politico magazine assigned me to go write a story about Bladen County. I didn't know what I was going to do. I didn't know there were already reporters in Bladen County, including Nick, who were investigating this election fraud scandal. And I came down about 4 days after everybody else did. Literally pulled over on the side of the road to watch the sunset over a field, over a cemetery, and see it sunset on the water tower in Bladen County. And just thought for a minute, like, what am I going to write about? And then I thought, I'm just going to write about this place. I'm going to write about why this place was ripe and fertile ground for election fraud. And that became sort of the bedding for our book, I think. I think our book is mostly about a place. It's hopefully a place that, even though it's in the Southeast, it's familiar to a lot of people, I think. It's a rural place where there's a lot of desperation. Bladen County is a hardworking place. Farming, hog farming, and tobacco used to be king there. It's just a place that I think is just rich with stories and human interest stories. And that's what I went after that day. And it became kind of the sort of, like I said, the bedding for our book. But Nick came at it from a different background, and he got all of the Nick was able to corral some of the most interesting people that I could have ever asked to interview. So Nick can talk about how he came after it.
And more important than being a reporter, I'm a TV reporter, like Michael said. I'm from 30 minutes down the road from Bladen County, North Carolina, and a town called Hope Mills, which is near Fort Bragg. My dad was in the Army. That's why we were there. So I grew up in southeastern North Carolina, and I know, generally speaking, the characters down there. And I also, most importantly to the story, knew that there had been allegations of election shenanigans being flung about in political contests in southeastern North Carolina for decades. I mean, my entire childhood. And so when we first heard the allegations in 2018, I didn't think they were really going to amount to anything. And even after they really picked up steam to the point where I was like, all right, crap, I guess I got to go down here and report on it. I knew that there was more to the story than what we'd heard so far. And that quest to find out the rest of it, the more, led me to a guy named McCrae Dallas, who's a political operative who's now charged with state felonies for essentially election fraud. And he is, basically the character at the center of the book. And that's from that day to the book. Here we are.
Right. So, I mean, can you talk? I mean, he's an interesting character in himself. Can you talk about who McCrae Dallas is? Dowless, and it's Bladen County, Bladen County, kind of in the southeast. Can you talk about him and the context of Bladen County?
Yeah, absolutely. So McCrae, fascinating guy. He's a Bladen County person through and through. He was born. Actually, he may have been born right over the border in Robeson County, if we're being factually accurate. But anyways, he grew up his whole life in Bladen County. He'd left to do some construction work in his younger adulthood years, but always came back to Bladen County. And he's become, until 2018, for probably from 2000 or so to 2018, he was one of the main political dudes in town. And certainly after about the 2010 election, he was the main Republican political guy in town who you'd call if you wanted to win an election. He's also a convicted felon. He committed insurance fraud in the early 90s and was pleaded guilty to that and was convicted of that and served some time in prison. He kind of has a reputation for being, I think we call him in the book is the best way to describe him, as a flim-flam man, kind of a fraudster a little bit. And that's certainly has that reputation among some people in Bladen County. And amongst other people, he's a straight up whip smart political operative who knows how to win you an election. And that one guy with those two reputations is the same person.
Yeah, you wrote. Sorry to interrupt, but you wrote something really funny in your book. He knows what the votes can count before the votes take place, right?
Yeah, absolutely, and that's because he knows the people. I mean, you can drive down the road with them in Bladen County, and he can tell you who lives in that house, who their parents are, who your brothers and sisters are, and when the last election they voted in was, and whether or not they have an outstanding absentee ballot that year. I mean, it's interesting. A lot of what he was doing, maybe a little more than this, but the heart of what he was doing is really just kind of sophisticated voter targeting and voter turnout. Just happened to be doing it with a pen and paper, chain smoking in a wood paneled kitchen.
Right. And can you kind of talk, he grew up in that environment. Can you talk about the changes in Bladen County and the demographics?
Yeah. So Bladen County's always been a rural place, right? But as Mike alluded to a minute ago, it was once rural and always people had to work hard for what they had. But, when tobacco was king down there, people were doing pretty all right. And tobacco farmers and farming when that was a thing, and to a lesser extent in that part of the world, textiles as well. And they've seen the story that so many rural places in America, and certainly so many rural counties in North Carolina, of declining jobs, the rise of opioid use, in Bladen County in particular, and others around it have really suffered from climate change. They've been hit with 2 500-year hurricanes and, more importantly, 500-year floods within 2 years. And so that's really left people desperate.
And it's kind of a shifting thing. It used to be stalwartly Democratic, right? And so you've seen a white shift. And can you talk kind of about the racial kind of tensions and background of that area?
Yeah, it was up until 10 years ago, close to 70 to 80% Democratic. But a lot of the folks who were Democrats in that county were sort of from the old, and in the South, we say this word a lot, and it's well known when you say somebody's a Jesse-crat, he voted for Jesse Helms, who was, he was a long-standing conservative. So, I mean, a lot of these folks were that. It's just that pretty much in 2010, after Bladen County for the first time elected a black sheriff, a lot of white folks in Bladen County switched parties to the Republican Party and tried to rally around a white sheriff in the next election, or white sheriff's candidate in the next election, actually successfully rallied around a white sheriff's candidate in the next election. And I think what we saw with that and what we show in our book, I think, is one of the most important things in Bladen County is the sheriff. And he's the most important position in the county. And for all of the ways that folks try to say, I'm not racist, I'm not this and that, when it came down to it in Bladen County in 2010, when the person in charge of the law became a black person, a lot of white people got really scared and wanted to change that very fast. And that's just a fact of the matter. And I don't think anybody argues with that. Even the folks who we talked to in the book wouldn't argue with that. So it's that spurred the flip. And when we started thinking about that, when Nick and I really started thinking about that, we started thinking, gosh, like, there's got to be history behind this somewhere. And I knew a little bit about the history of Bladen County at the time in Eastern North Carolina and sort of voter suppression efforts since Reconstruction. And as soon as we started going back in time, go back 10 years, go back 20 years, all of these things repeat themselves over and over and over again, all the way back to the Civil War.
Right. And maybe you can just go to that background and talk about that history, that the past is present. Present isn't that far past.
Nick just recorded, well, and back in September, Nick recorded the audiobook, and I'll never forget him calling me or texting me and saying just how similar some of the things he was reading out loud. Again, it just kind of hit him, like how similar some of the things he was reading out loud are to today. And yeah, I mean, you're talking about massive disinformation campaigns happened in the late 1800s. You're talking about fractured, if you think that the media, quote, the media is biased today, you should read headlines from the 1800s. You should see what the Raleigh News and Observer was doing in the 1800s to run propaganda campaigns for a white supremacist movement that was literally titled a white supremacist movement. Like, this wasn't like, these weren't just terms back then. There was a handbook. There was a white supremacist handbook at the time. And the Raleigh News and Observer promoted it. And that ultimately led to something that is now well known in North Carolina. The only coup that ever happened on American soil was in 1898 in Wilmington, when Wilmington at the time had a predominantly black leadership. They had over 30 in just 30 years had become a predominantly black city with black leadership and a very successful city. And white folks did not like that too much, and they overthrew the government. They literally overthrew the government, and what happened after that? I mean, the things that happened after that were almost as crazy. Instead of calling it a coup, obviously, the folks who overthrew the government called it a riot, a race riot, and tried to make it seem like it was an even-handed dispute on both sides, when in fact, folks with guns turned out to the polls and threw out ballots, or made poll workers leave so that they could throw out ballots and things like that. And so when you start to peel back the layers on this, you start to wonder, like, we always say, we sort of think, for some reason, we think about the mid 20th century or whatever as good old days and stuff like that, when democracy was like, when everything was just fine. But the fact is, there's been troubles with our elections for a long, long time, and a lot of them have to do with race more than they have to do with political affiliation, race and power than a political affiliation. I think part 2 of our book is about 100 and some pages of just history explaining how we got to today. And Nick and I have said over and over again, as we've talked about this book, there's a straight line from Reconstruction to today, and we drew it. We drew it over just two or three generations of people. To show how some of the folks who were disenfranchised in 1898 were their descendants were the same folks who were being disenfranchised in 2010.
Wow, yeah, that's amazing. And I mean, it is incredible. And they had, I think there was the first black congressman was from Bladen County too. So there was a real hit. I think you wrote in your book, it's about 2/3 white, 1/3 black, right? In Bladen County to the day you say that. So there's a significant proportion. And I think you said there's one famous guy who really started the Black Wall Street in North Carolina, was from Bladen. So they have a history. Can you talk about some of the other kind of vote fixing things that happened over the 20th century?
Yeah, over well, and so in 1868, black people get the right to vote in North Carolina and in America, and black men, so in 1898, when folks were trying to figure out ways to disenfranchise those voters in North Carolina, they did what the state of Louisiana did. They passed what was called they passed these literacy tests, which are not really about how to read. It was basically, could you memorize the Constitution and recite it to me, types of stuff, and tests that truly very few people could pass. And at the time in North Carolina, the actual literacy rate in North Carolina was the same between white men and black men. So what they did in order to make this work for the white supremacist movement at the time, they passed grandfather clauses. And the grandfather clause said if you or your grandfather voted before 1868, voted in an election before 1868, you didn't have to take the literacy test. Well, that obviously meant that a significant number of white men didn't have to take this literacy test, and all black men did. and that effective. So yes, George Henry White is a major character in our book. He was the last black congressman to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives in 1901 before Jim Crow laws effectively eliminated black people from Congress for 28 years, I think it was, almost 30 years. And when he stood on the floor of the House, he delivered his famous Phoenix speech. He said something along the lines of, today you may have ruled the black man out of Congress, but Phoenix like he will rise up again one day. We just kind of, I had that quote written down, and I had just kept kind of looking at it as we kept writing this book, because the rise up line is just really interesting to me. And it's how long is it going to actually take for this to happen?
But I mean, it kind of is happening, right? Though, I mean, do you still see that African Americans are disenfranchised in Bladen County?
Well, that's the other part of the story, and the friction that led to what happened in 2018 is that in Bladen County and throughout North Carolina, black voters came together and banded together. Descendants of George Henry White went to Durham, created the Black Wall Street in Durham. They also created an organization called the Durham Committee on Negro Affairs, is what it was founded as, and it's remains today. And it was a group of black business owners and community leaders who formed because they wanted to find some political power in Durham. And to get things like a better bus entrance at the bus station. And they were successful. They found a formula to getting black representation in local government. And so out of that, these black political action committees and black political groups sprung up all over North Carolina. There's one in Charlotte where Mike and I live. And there's one in Bladen County called the Bladen County Improvement Association. And that group got a start. The Durham Committee formed in the 50s. The Bladen County Improvement Association didn't form until the late 70s, early 80s. And they were hugely successful fairly quickly. First thing they had to do was they filed a lawsuit and got the county commission basically redrawn. They got seats added. They got at-large districts. They got some districts drawn to where there would be some black representation. And kind of the pinnacle of their political success was this 2010 election in which a black man was elected sheriff. And so that certainly brought things to a head, kind of clashing. And you have to speak in these frank racial terms because that's how people exist in Bladen County, or black people and white people, wanted to win elections, and they were both really good at winning elections by that point because the Improvement Association had gained a lot of political power, a lot of organizing strength. And so you had the Bladen County Improvement Association, and then on the other end you had McCrae Dallas and the kind of McCrae Dallas operation, working for mainly at that point Republicans, although he'd previously worked for Democrats. In fact, learned a lot of what he knew from the Improvement Association and working for them in the 90s. And so it's that clash and the quest to beat one another. And in this, that led to what happened in 2018.
Right. So it was kind of a slow process. Can you talk in greater detail about Dallas's operation and how he functioned?
Yeah.
And you guys met with him, you're in the book going to his house and hanging out with him, right?
Oh, yeah. We spent many an hour and watching him chain smoke in his kitchen and chain smoke other places.
Seems like a real character.
I talked to McCrae just the other day. I'm still in touch with him. And so, basically, I'll start with this disclaimer. McCrae is not the only person doing this. And in fact, my favorite story that I love to tell is a colleague of mine at the TV station I work, WBTV, on the ground in 2018, uncovered a complaint filed with the County Board of Elections that someone with the Improvement Association didn't come by to pick up his ballot in the 2018 election. He complained that no one came to harvest his ballot, which is illegal in North Carolina. And so, largely speaking, what McCrae is charged with doing and what there's evidence people in Bladen County do is go out and you get people, you send workers out and you tell them get as many people to request absentee ballots as possible. And McRae would pay his folks, and this might be where the groups differ, right, is how they pay, for instance. But McRae would pay his folks, like $100 per 20 ballots or something. So like $5 or ballot request form. So about $5 a ballot request form. So Bladen County, big county, maybe the largest county by square miles, maybe in North Carolina. It's like more than 800 square miles. And it's rural. There are 30,000 people who live there. And so to get, 20 absentee request forms in a day, that might be hard work. I mean, I've driven to a lot of homes in Bladen County. They're not close to each other, and they're down maybe dirt roads, and. So he sends an army of workers out to go get people to fill out these request forms, and it's perfectly legal to take those forms and drop them off at the Board of Elections. Although, by the time 2018 rolled around, in an effort to try and at least track the shenanigans, you had to, every time you dropped off a stack of request forms, you had to sign them in and how many you were dropping off and sign your name. And then after that, at some point, the absentee ballots are mailed. And then this is where it gets tricky. You, depending on who's telling the story, you either send workers out in pairs to go knock on doors and say, hi, we know from this election data from the Board of Elections that you've gotten your absentee ballot. Do you need us to witness it for you while you vote? Because in North Carolina in 2018, you needed 2 people to sign it as witnesses saying they watched you vote your ballot. Since then, it's been changed to 1. So in theory, you'd send 2 people out and witness the ballot, and then you'd vote, and then they'd watch you put it in the mail maybe, and you'd put it in your mailbox, raise a little flag, and back your ballot would go. Now, we know that people might just send 1 election worker out there, and even though 2 people would sign it, we know that people might take ballots. There was evidence from one person who was working for McRae in 2016 that he was, because they got paid per request form, calling old buddies who didn't even live in Bladen County anymore, but were still registered to vote there, saying, hey, can I essentially fill out this form and forge your signature and request a ballot? And then the ballot came in the name of his friend, and this worker texted his friend, quote, yo, do you care who you vote for president? And he filled out this guy's ballot. Yeah, the guy didn't care. You'll be shocked to know. Filled out his ballot. And so we know that was going on as well. But broadly speaking, those are the confines of the operation, and there are several steps along the way in which you could break the law.
Right. So there was certain steps, and then you talked about one of the races where I think there was a third party who won all the mail-in ballots.
So this is what triggers. This is what triggers the thing that ultimately triggers the 2018 scandal. So McRae, until 2020, lost his reelection. He was also an elected official in Bladen County. He was on the Soil and Water Conservation Board. And so he was up for reelection in 2016 and unopposed. And the Bladen County Improvement Association, remember I said at this point, they don't really like McRae because McRae's beaten them and they want to beat McRae. And they basically got together and like, well, crap, we can't let him run unopposed. We got to challenge him. So they mounted a write-in candidate, a guy in Bladen County named Franklin Graham. No, not Billy Graham's son, but certainly literally the same name. So that helps. And he was supported by the Bladen County Improvement Association. And so the handwriting on all these ballots writing in Franklin Graham are literally the same. And maybe 2 or 3 different variations of the 2 or 3 different people who might go out and help people vote, but more or less the same. And people started looking at this and they thought, well, this is real weird. And McRae, the write-in campaign was not successful. But in 2016, we had a Republican governor, a guy named Pat McCrory, who lost his reelection to our current governor, Roy Cooper. And the McCrory campaign, the margin wasn't close enough to trigger an automatic recall, but it was pretty tight. And so the McCrory campaign was going around the state trying to figure out how can we question what are some things we can do to maybe try to launch a legal challenge to the results of this race. So they found, the Bladen Improvement PAC. They found some evidence of the Improvement PAC maybe altering some ballots, and that that would be enough to get it close enough to where we could be in business on challenging it. So the Pat McCrory campaign and lawyers for Pat McCrory call down to McCrae Dallas, and they convince him to file a protest challenging an election that he won. And so he does it, and he files this affidavit, and he goes to the state board for a hearing in December, and it becomes very apparent very quickly that McCrae was being used by the Pat McCrory campaign and didn't really know any of the substance of this affidavit that he'd filed in support of this challenge. But it brought attention to what was going on in Bladen County, both by the Improvement PAC and, unfortunately for McCrae, by what he was doing. And so at the end of that hearing in 2016 on McCrae's complaint, the state board of elections ended up voting to investigate and refer for criminal prosecution, both McCrae's operation and the Improvement Association. And that's what happened.
And so that led, and can you talk about how that unraveled and what led to 2018?
I just want to sort of put into terms what Nick just said. Like, McCrae brought let's say somebody broke into your house, and you decided to bring a claim to say somebody broke into your house, and then you get charged with breaking into somebody else, and while you're in court, it's found out that you've been breaking into people's houses too, and they're going to bring charges against you. I mean, that's essentially what happened. So then the elections board sends several 100-page document to the U.S. Attorney's Office in the Eastern District of North Carolina and says there's fraud happening in Bladen County. We need to look at McCrae Dallas. We need to look at the Improvement Association. And that file sat on the desk of the U.S. Attorney for almost 2 years. He never looked at it, never opened it. He was investigating election fraud, or he was supposedly investigating election fraud. He was sending folks out to check the status of undocumented immigrants who were voting. And he ultimately found, I think, 12 or 13 cases of it total, instead of investigating this massive operation that was rounding up hundreds of votes in Bladen County.
That resulted in misdemeanor. and a couple people pleaded guilty and got $100 fines. And we're not making it up.
Wow.
Meanwhile, these people are out doing whatever they're doing in Bladen County.
Yeah. So, I mean, and that is the ultimate point of our book is, we're not going to get to the end of actually what happened, but the ultimate point of our book is it's not as up or down, I think, as either political party makes it. It's not as clear as either political party makes it today. And we won't mention them, but you say that one political party is telling you that election fraud is rampant. That's not true. The other political party is telling you that election fraud doesn't happen. It's not true. But the point is, what we do have systems in place to stop it, and those systems have to work. And you can't be chasing fake election fraud claims. And you can't. This is the really frustrating thing right now for Nick and myself, is that we've got this book out into the world, and we're starting to see, states. I think this issue is going to be a big issue in 2022 because states are coming up with they're coming up with these sort of wild claims of election fraud in 2020. You see it in Wisconsin, you see it in Georgia, and it's all seeding this distrust. And the fact is, election fraud actually happens. We don't need to make stuff up. We actually don't need to make it up. So,
what did the Associated Press just report? Right, there are 470 something cases of voter fraud in the 2020 election, and no, that's not enough to upend the election, right? But that's 400 plus cases of voter fraud. And if you care actually about enforcing voter fraud, you would stop wasting resources chasing made up conspiracy theories, and you would invest those resources into actually investigating the voter fraud.
The real
and
stuff,
unlike what the U.S. Attorney in North Carolina was doing, who was chasing these low level, if they even existed, misdemeanors, 12 or 13 people that took them years to investigate, while the 300 pages that included the text, "Joe, do you care who you vote for?" from a guy filling out another guy's ballot, sat there collecting dust.
Right. And I mean, do you get the feeling after doing all this research in Bladen County that there's probably these kind of unknown lower level figures like McCrae Dallas in other parts of North Carolina, if not in all the states of the union.
It's interesting as we've been on the book tour and talked to folks. We've actually heard of people saying, bringing up more cases that happened that are known throughout North Carolina, and we don't sit on an island in North Carolina. We're not the only people with rural places. We're not the only people with political machines. Yeah, election fraud happens. As we say somewhere in our book, or maybe in a description for the book, McCrae stole an election, one absentee ballot at a time, and that's how it happened. It's a guy with a pen and a pencil, chain smoking in his kitchen in Bladen County, right? And he was doing this while the Board of Elections was rightfully focused on securing our elections from Russia and from hackers and, all these systems. This guy is doing it the analog way, and his opponents are doing it the analog way too. Right. Yeah, they exist all over the country, and we have to have the will to want to investigate. And we also have to have systems and people who take their jobs seriously enough to go forth and investigate when the evidence is there.
And isn't it like a lot of the dispute? It's about these absentee ballots is one of the main kind of issues too, right? Is these paper ballots and the drops. At least here in California, that's like now they have ballot drop boxes. At least in my town, it's pretty remarkable. It's really about these. That's one major component of it, right?
Mm-hmm, certainly. And there's nothing that we uncovered to suggest that absentee ballots aren't secure and aren't a good way to vote. I mean, there are whole states that vote via absentee, right? Functionally. And what we have found, though, is there are ways you can use absentee ballots to game the system, but they become pretty apparent, right? I mean, you could look at some data, and one person did from 2016, and you could tell what McCrae was doing, but no one did it. No one did anything about it.
Interesting, yeah. Like they knew the anomalies are there.
Yeah. Right. When they would see batches of absentee ballots show up at the Board of Elections at the same time. Well, because someone was mailing them in, right? Right. And so, again, does that mean the ballot wasn't secure and voting by absentee wasn't secure? No, it means that someone dropped the ball or looked the other way at the evidence that McCrae and the Improvement Association was doing some things that might need a second look.
Interesting. And your title has the preachers into it. What is the part of like the church involved in some of these events?
Well, the central character, the central candidate in the race that upended all of this was a Baptist minister or Baptist pastor. He was, and not just in any church. He was in the biggest church in Charlotte, or the First Baptist Church in Charlotte, downtown Charlotte. One of the biggest congregations in the state of North Carolina. He was the leader of the Baptist convention here, which is a huge.
It's the biggest denomination in North Carolina, right? Is Baptist?
I believe so. I can't say for sure, but it's massive.
Anecdotally, that feels true.
Yeah. Southern Baptist, have ruled the South for a long time, and he was that character. So he was the candidate in this race. He won an election by 905 votes, and that was enough for the elections board to say, hey, we should probably look into what could be enough of these tainted votes that could have turned this over. So if there wasn't a close race, we wouldn't have seen the election fraud scandal happen, and we wouldn't have written a book. Like, if the fact is, the only reason that anybody looked at it was because it was only a 905 vote difference out of like 60,000 votes or something like that, where they were like, oh, okay, all right, now it's close enough that whatever McCrae Dallas is doing is not just funny anymore. It could have actually overturned this election.
I mean, it's just really an amazing cast of characters. You guys are really good, descriptive, colorful terms for a lot of these people. And really interesting book. You already have like 6 5-star reviews on Amazon. I saw that.
Yes, keep them coming.
Yeah. So how would you like to? There's a lot more to the book. The history part of 100 pages is very detailed. Can you kind of wrap it up? How would you like to end this? Anything I missed, or what can people expect to see in other later parts of the book? Maybe you can do a quick summary.
Look, the story is about so my wife, when we were writing the book and we were waiting for it to come out, and I'd say, oh, I've written a book, or I'm writing a book. And I would start to tell people what the book's about. My wife would always interrupt me and say, Nick, it's really much more interesting than that. You're not doing a very good job explaining it. As Mike said at the beginning, this book is about a place, Bladen County in southeastern North Carolina, and the people in that place. And they're all characters. And the history of those people. They've not just been characters in 2018. They've always been characters, almost by nature of where they are. And our book is about the characters over time and the forces of history that collided in 2018 to create this crazy ass story and shenanigans that blew up, that led to a congressional race being thrown out for voter fraud for the first time in modern political history. And the book does that. It weaves a crazy yarn. It's entertaining. Michael Graff is the best writer you'll ever read. And, he made this book really, really interesting. And the characters are interesting people to read about. So I hope people will read it, like it, and take a lesson from it.
Good. Anything you'd like to add, Mike?
No, I just hope people care about the folks in our book. I mean, that's what it is. It's a book about people. I always say, like, I'm not writing about politics and I'm not writing about sports. I'm writing about people. And we're trying to write about people at an interesting pivot point in their lives. And there's a lot of crazy folks in our book.
And there is an audio version too. So if people want to listen, they can get the audio version as well, right?
That's right.
9.5 hours of listening to yours truly.
Nice. So you are the narrator. And where's the best place to get it? It's on Amazon for sure. Do you have signed copies, or can people reach out? Do you have a website for the book?
No.
Well, yeah. I mean, it's on Amazon. It's on UNC Press. Our publisher is University of North Carolina Press. You can go through Indie Pro and order it through your local, your local bookstore. Would be a good book to go through.
Anywhere books are sold.
And take a picture of it and send it to us, because we're getting that now, which is really fun to see. I got one tag last night in a city I didn't even know our book was in, and somebody tagged me and said,
nice.
Here's your book on the top shelf at Amazon or at Barnes and Noble. So it was fun.
Congratulations. And do you guys have social media accounts? Anything you'd like to share, email or anything if people want to reach out to you?
Yeah, I'm Michael N. Graff at Michael N. Graff on most Twitter, Instagram, things like that.
I'm at Nick Ochsner News, I think.
Nick Ochsner News. So I can put that in the show notes too. If people want to reach out to you, Instagram, or send you pictures of the book.
Yeah, on Twitter. We're all over Twitter. Big Twitter people.
Good. All right, good. And again, the two authors are Michael Graff and Nick Ochsner. Title of the book is The Vote Collectors, the true story of the scamsters, politicians, and preachers behind the nation's greatest electoral fraud. Just published November 16, 2021. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having us.
Great.
Stay there.